This is the lecture for Chapter 3, Evidence and Probability in Defining Effective Teaching Practices. Some things work better than other things. Chapter 3 begins with another conversation between Terrence and Bruce. If you recall from previous chapters, Bruce is a retired math teacher, and he frequently converses with Terrence, our book's author, about the state of education and teaching. When asked, "How do you know what an effective teacher looks like?" Bruce's response is, "I know I was a good math teacher because I've always been good at math." Terrence says, "But how do you know you were effective at teaching?" Bruce responds, "I just told you, I don't like to brag, but I am very gifted at math." Naturally, Terrence isn't convinced that simply knowing the content equals ability to teach. So, how do we make judgments about teaching? As a society, we believe soccer players make the best soccer coaches, musicians the best people to teach someone how to play a new instrument. An artist is best suited to teach art classes. But using this logic, since we're all readers, would we all be equally cut out to be reading teachers? In this chapter, we'll move beyond the question of what it takes to be an effective teacher and begin discussing effective teaching strategies. In Chapter 3, we'll focus on those behaviors, strategies, tricks, and procedures that provide the highest probability for success. As you read the chapter, consider how you will answer the following questions. Why should research play a leading role in how we define effective teaching practices? Describe why positive behavior interventions and supports, or PBIS, are an example of multi-tiered intervention. What does it mean to say that a practice is evidence-based? What are some common misinterpretations of evidence-based practices? And what is the logic of early intervention based on a normal curve? Multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS, provide a framework for intervention across all staff and students in the school. Keep in mind, a framework is not a program or a curriculum. It is a structure from which programs and curriculums can be facilitated. PBIS, or Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, is an example of MTSS that is applied to behavior, and RTI, or Response to Intervention, is an example of MTSS that is applied to academics, typically reading and math. Across the tiers, the focus of MTSS is on the simplest effective strategies to improve the probability of student success. At the school-wide level, primary tier, which is also referred to as universal supports or Tier 1, intervention is largely based on effective teaching and the delivery of instruction. Whether academic or behavioral, the highest probability for success involves students knowing how and being encouraged to engage in successful behavior. When that instruction is not effective with some students, our focus turns to a second tier of intervention. At the second tier, students receive additional instruction in some individualized strategies aimed at small groups. After continuous assessment at Tier 2, some students will demonstrate a need for further intervention. Thus, these students will require more diagnostic assessment and highly individualized intervention plans as part of Tier 3. The logic of MTSS can be explained through 4 basic steps that comprise the 3-tiered framework. The 4 steps are: 1, identification of predictable failures; 2, development of effective preventative strategies; 3, consistent application; and 4, evaluation of outcomes. To understand how MTSS presents a logic of simplicity, let us consider a basic analogy of how the 4 steps are implemented across the tiers. Let us imagine that a dangerous flu is going around the school, and 3 things are known about this flu. 1, it is extremely contagious, and it's spread easily through contact with anything that's been exposed to germs. 2, it is characterized by a low-grade fever that is treated easily and effectively in the early stages with simple liquids and vitamins. And 3, if the fever escalates to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, it can be deadly, requires prescription medications, and maybe even surgery. We could just wait for students to get extremely high fevers and then notify the hospitals to have surgeons on call at the hospital. But it'd make more sense to develop an instructional plan. It won't be enough to just tell students about personal hygiene for safety. So, at the universal Tier 1 level, we will directly and explicitly teach students some needed skills. We will teach them hand washing. This will include how much soap, how long, and rinsing. We'll also teach students that coughing and sneezing into their sleeve will prevent germs from being on hands, and to keep their hands away from their face, not share personal items, and throw away tissues and items that could potentially be infected. Again, because lives are at stake, all teachers will teach explicitly, not just tell students, as a primary universal prevention strategy. Rather than waiting for students to present with higher fevers, we can use a universal screener for finding out those students who are most at risk of illness. Since we know that a low-grade fever is a predictor of the flu, we'll need a quick and easy way to assess students' temperatures. The nurse provides an idea to have students wear heat-sensitive strips on their neck or forehead, as these strips are inexpensive and can be applied across all students and allows adults to easily assess students each day as they go about their business. Now, if a temperature strip shows a fever above a predetermined level, there needs to be an agreed upon course of action. Our initial preventative interventions won't be successful for all, and a few students will need additional interventions. Since the flu responds well to liquids and vitamins at the earliest stages, we'll send students with the lowest criterion fevers to the cafeteria for some chicken soup. We'll continue to monitor our fevered students, but some students will be non-responders and their fevers will continue to rise. Interventions for these students will need to be more individualized. Even though we know surgery is the most effective tool, its high price and side effects guide our continued prevention efforts. Still, we must be realistic and understand that there will be a few students who do not respond to any of our interventions and will require prescription medication and maybe even surgery. Within the flu description, there are several key components that provide an analogy for MTSS. First, schools need to have some way of predicting student failures. What is your thermometer on the forehead for behavior, reading, or math in this school? Second, prevention should begin at the school-wide level and should be as simple as possible while remaining logical. The more effective the instruction is for all students, the fewer students will be in need of more intensive interventions. Third, whether the intervention involves basic instruction, applying chicken soup, or some more individualized practices, consistency across time and adults is critical. If only some adults are teaching effective hygiene, or the chicken soup is delivered only occasionally, then we can expect our system to be ineffective. Next, the data we collect as we assess the success of the intervention become the information we'll use to be more precise as we reconsider prediction and prevention. The entire process becomes a cycle. Predict, prevent, be consistent, assess effect, and make more precise prevention efforts. When we look at all of the practices that are currently labeled somewhere as evidence-based, it becomes clear that not all are equal. Some evidence-based interventions work better than others. As educators, we have the ethical responsibility to select the practices, interventions, and procedures that provide the greatest probability for success. Let's return to the idea of a teacher wager discussed in Chapter 1. In this wager, you, the teacher, will receive a cash payout of $10,000 if the intervention is successful. We'll consider a behavioral example. Let's say that if Devin can raise his hand to speak instead of yelling out during 80% of trials by next week, you can get the $10,000. In this case, your focus as a teacher would be on finding the intervention, practice, or procedure that provides the best chance of success. If money were on the line, would you select an intervention with a 70% chance of working, or go with the intervention that has a 90% chance of success? Looking at intervention research, why would you choose an intervention that produces an effect size of plus 23 when another has demonstrated an average effect size of plus 57? Again, early intervention is a must to prevent snowballs from growing too large in the direction of failure, so we don't want to wait. What works for other students likely will need to be done with more intensity and effort to work for those with a long history of failure. In this graphic, that's our students down here in a -3 or -2. These snowballs are quite large. A typical student requires 3 to 5 successes for every failure. So students in the typical average range, they need 3 to 5 successes for every failure. However, when we look at our students who have longer histories of failure or are on the hard left, they may require 20 or more successes for every failure just to push them back up the hill. Table 3.1 in your text provides guidelines for selecting interventions. Evidence exists in the form of valid research on the effects of intervention. This means that there has been a study that measures outcomes in a peer-reviewed professional journal. We'll want to select these interventions. We'll also look to make sure that the evidence has been replicated by other researchers and that the researchers have no conflict of interest with study outcomes or were adequately blinded. It was a blinded study. We'll also want to be sure that there is direct evidence of change in student outcomes as a result of the intervention, not just measures of teacher perception. We'll also want to be sure that when we select an intervention, the evidence is published in a peer-refereed journal or other peer-reviewed outlet. In other words, it's not an opinion piece. And finally, we'll want to be sure that when selecting an intervention, there is no equally credible contradictory evidence. This concludes the lecture for Chapter 3. Let's look now at your assignment for the week. In Chapter 3 assignment, you will answer the 5 discussion questions in the chapter, and as a 6th portion of the assignment, you will conduct a review of research to find a behavioral intervention or strategy that is evidence-based. Please use the table in 3.1 as a reference. You will provide a brief description of the intervention or strategy as well as the source. That concludes the lecture for Chapter 3.